Today, space radar is going to spot the bullshit for us. Over at Wiki, space radar. Space radar is a proposed constellation of active radar satellites for the United States Department of Defense. So it's proposed. So the SBR system or constellation isn't even active yet. That in itself is incredibly acting. The world's superpower in space, America, doesn't have a space-based radar system in place, even now. Incredibly revealing. But we'll continue. The SBR system will allow detection and tracking of aircraft and ocean-going vessels, similar to the Soviet USA program. We're going to have a look at that in a minute. And potentially land vehicles from space. This information would then be relayed to regional and national control command centres, as well as the E-10 Airborne Command Post. The E-10 hasn't even been built yet. Then we get a list of short list of active military radar satellites by country. We don't really need to entertain these guys because what we're going to look at is going to highlight the absurdity of this space-based radar. The stars of today: America, Russia, and our dear friends India. And we're going to start by having a look at this Soviet USA program, their space-based radar constellation system that the US hoped to replicate. Bear with me. Here's the Russian space-based radar system that the US hoped to replicate, supposedly. USA, also known in the West as the Radio Ocean Reconnaissance Satellite, or RORSAT. RORSAT was a series of 33 Soviet reconnaissance satellites. You got your number straight away. Launched between 1967 and 1988 to monitor NATO and merchant vessels using radar. The satellites were powered by nuclear reactors. Because a return signal from an ordinary target illuminated by a radar transmitter diminishes as the inverse of the fourth power of the distance, for the surveillance radar to work effectively, USA satellites had to be placed in a lower Earth orbit. Had they used large solar panels for power, the orbit would have rapidly decayed due to drag through the upper atmosphere. And we get a cartoon here. The problem is with that story about the drag and the lack of solar panels, and of course we get a cartoon rather than any evidence whatsoever to suggest there's a spacecraft orbiting a scientifically impossible ball. The problem is when we look at the equivalent of what India are citing that is doing the same job, that is supposedly in the same height orbit, albeit in a slightly different orbit, but is certainly, according to the official statistics, orbiting at the same height in low Earth orbit, and their design tech has giant solar panels. So it kind of contradicts the Russian story and kind of highlights the silliness of the Russian cartoon, and the Russian cartoon kind of highlights the silliness of the Indian cartoon. Let me just show you the Indian equivalent of what supposedly does this job. It just debunks this silly story straight off the bat. Bear with me. This is the Indian equivalent. And look at their design. Loads of drag. The Russians couldn't have their satellite, had to be apparently nuclear powered, which is insane anyway. But India, their cartoon, contradicts Russia's cartoon. And of course, the pair of them highlight how absurd each other are with their contradictions. Because this is supposedly doing the same job and would have loads of drag, which is strange anyway, considering you're in a vacuum, supposedly. So none of your stories make sense. But then you contradict each other anyway. But it's only going to get worse for Russia. So we look at the timelines here regarding this satellite program, and it starts in 1967, and it deals with NATO and merchant vessels using radar. So they're going to need real data. So they're going to need something to do this job that this cartoon nuclear powered satellite supposedly does. So I thought, okay, wouldn't it be interesting if a plane comes out in 1967 that does the very same job this cartoon-powered nuclear fucking pantomime supposedly does? And sure enough, the Ilyushin 38, probably butchered that, sorry. The Ilyushin 38, get this, is a maritime patrol aircraft and anti-submarine warfare aircraft designed, of course, in the Soviet Union. And what year do you think this plane came out? This plane that does exactly the same job as Russia's space radar system, which became active in 1967. What year do you think this plane was introduced? Surprise, surprise. Nice old school plane, by the way. We come down, first flight, 61. Introduced, 67. Still in service to this day, which should tell you all you need to know. And in fact, look, India have them. We just saw India's space cartoon satellite debunk Russians' space cartoon satellite, their nuclear-powered cartoon. And now we see India actually using Russian planes to do the jobs their cartoons were supposedly doing anyway. Can you see how obvious all of this is? So we got Russia and India using this plane still to this day. To this day. And of course this plane does the job of what those supposed satellites, the radar-based system which came out in 67 did. And of course, the plane came out the same year because it needed to provide the data that supposedly came from the satellites. Oh dear. Is the Tupolev 142, which came out in 1972, which of course, again, does the job these supposed satellites do. And of course, to this day, this old plane is still in service. Still in service. You would have thought if you had a space-based radar system in place in the 60s, you might have wanted to do away with these old planes and you would have replaced your space-based system with more updated tech. Of course, you can, because the space-based radar system is these old planes. And the reason you can't get rid of these old planes in favour of new satellites to do the job you were supposedly doing in the 60s with satellites is because these old planes are the satellites. Before I hammer the final nail home, let's just refresh our memories regarding this Russian so-called space-based radar system. Rorsat was a series of 33 Soviet reconnaissance satellites launched between 1967 and 1988 to monitor NATO and merchant vessels using radar. So basically planes and vessels supposedly being monitored from this Rorsat satellite program that began in 1967. Again, if that was true, you would have thought by now the Russians wouldn't really be dependent for the safety of their fleet, their navy, at sea, on old-fashioned helicopters, which they are, as we're about to see. Particularly if you had a space-based radar system detecting vessels and enemy aircraft from NATO or whoever in 1967. We know you haven't because it's planes. But your old vintage helicopters, which you use to this day, highlight the fact you never had a space-based radar system in the first place. Otherwise, you would have done away with your vintage helicopter collection years ago. Here's the Russian K-25 radar helicopter, which came out in 1965, 2 years before the satellite program, the radar space-based satellite program for Russia, begun. This helicopter is still in use to this day and provides long-range radar protection for the Russian Navy and can also be used as well for anti-submarine detection. Got a few shots, like I say, from 65 and is still in use to this day, which in itself highlights the absurdity of this space-based radar system which was there in 1967. But strangely enough, the Russian Navy are still dependent on retro helicopters to provide their radar protection at the sea, when the very satellite program that started in 67 was supposedly to detect vessels and craft on the sea. But of course, the planes that came out that year highlighted the absurdity of that. And of course, we're looking at the helicopters, the retro helicopters that defend the Russian Navy at sea and the fact they're still in use to this day, again highlights the absurdity of space. Not forgetting the K-31 radar helicopter, which has been providing protection for the Russian Navy since the mid-80s. Obviously, we looked at the 25, which has been providing protection for the Russian Navy since the 60s. And then we've got this newer helicopter, which came out in the 80s. Both are still being used to this day, like I said, to provide radar protection for the Russian Navy. You would have thought if the Russian radar system, space-based radar system, which was implemented in 1967, was true, Russia would have done away with these old helicopters and these old planes years ago. They can't, because the space-based radar system is a lie, because the globe's a lie. The data that supposedly comes from space-based radars comes from these helicopters and the planes that we looked at. It's obvious, otherwise these planes and helicopters would have been retired years ago. There would be no use for them. But these space giants like Russia and America are so dependent on stuff like this to this day. And what better way to finish by highlighting the space superpower that is America, and the fact their naval fleet is still to this day dependent for protection on 1960s propeller airplanes. This is the E-2 Hawkeye, came out in 1964, and is still active to this day, providing protection for the naval fleet of America. There's 4 of these on every single aircraft carrier. You would have thought if the claims being made were true regarding space and of course the place we reside, all of these vintage aircraft, which all these military seem so dependent on, would be put in industrial museums by now. But no, they can't, because this is what you get. This is your real world data, which supposedly comes from space. Sorry if that's a bitter pill for you to swallow, but it's one you're going to have to taste and consume. We've been lied to on a massive scale. This video should have made it rather obvious. If not, that's on you, I'm afraid.